Imagine waking up one morning to a world where clothing is no longer a legal or social requirement. You step outside, and instead of streets filled with people in jeans, dresses, and business suits, you find a wide range of human bodies on display. Some wearing clothes by choice, others not wearing anything at all. The rulebook for public attire has been tossed out and a new cultural experiment has begun. Such a world would fundamentally change how we interact, perceive each other, and even how societies function on both a practical and psychological level. This shift would ripple through nearly every area of life, from economics and fashion to tourism, mental health, law enforcement, and cultural norms. Understanding this scenario requires peeling back the layers of human behavior, history, economics, and even biology to imagine just how profound the impacts would be. The first and perhaps most obvious impact would be on social norms and human psychology. For centuries, humans have worn clothes not only for protection from the elements, but also for modesty, identity, and status. Clothing has been a primary way of communicating who we are. Our profession, wealth, culture, personality, and even mood. Removing the requirement for clothing in public dismantles one of the most deeply ingrained social norms in human history. Some individuals would embrace the newfound freedom, enjoying the comfort and liberation of not having to conform to strict dress codes. Others would experience discomfort or even anxiety, especially in cultures where modesty is strongly tied to moral values. The human brain is wired to respond to visual stimuli, especially when it comes to the human form. So such a change could alter everything from how we focus in a classroom to how we conduct business meetings. Eye contact might become more challenging in some situations, and interactions could initially be awkward as people adjust to a world where the human body is no longer concealed by default. From an economic standpoint, the fashion industry would be hit with a massive disruption. Clothing manufacturing is one of the largest industries in the world, employing millions and contributing billions to global GDP. If clothes became optional, many consumers would drastically cut their spending on apparel. Fashion retailers, luxury brands, and even secondhand clothing shops would see steep declines in sales. Entire supply chains, from cotton farmers to textile factories, would face upheaval. Some companies might pivot towards selling optional, functional clothing for specific environments or weather conditions, rather than as a constant necessity. Others might shift into the production of accessories, personal adornments, and wearable technology, betting that even in a clothing-optional world, people would still want ways to express themselves and stand out. Jewelry, body paint, tattoos, and piercings could see a renaissance as primary forms of self-decoration and identity expression. The tourism sector would likely undergo significant transformations as well. Some destinations would market themselves as open, clothing-optional havens, attracting visitors interested in the novelty or the liberation of such environments. Beach resorts, hot springs, and warm climate destinations could see a boom in visitors, eager to experience this new freedom in a comfortable setting. However, other regions might impose stricter rules to maintain traditional norms, especially in places with strong religious or conservative values. The result could be a global patchwork of clothing policies, with some countries embracing the change and others resisting it. Travel advisories might need to include cultural guidelines for public nudity, much like how travelers today are advised about appropriate dress codes in various regions. One of the more fascinating effects would be on human health and hygiene. On one hand, increased skin exposure to sunlight could improve vitamin D levels in populations that currently experience deficiencies, which could benefit bone health and overall immunity. On the other hand, more skin exposure also means greater vulnerability to sunburn, skin cancer, insect bites, and environmental pollutants. The sunscreen industry might grow exponentially as it becomes as essential as soap or toothpaste. Gyms and fitness culture could also boom as people become more self-conscious about their bodies being visible in public. However, this could cut both ways. While some might be motivated to stay fit, others might experience heightened anxiety or body dysmorphia from constant comparisons. Mental health professionals would likely see new challenges related to body image, social acceptance, and self-esteem. Law enforcement and legal systems would have to adapt rapidly. Laws related to indecent exposure, lewd conduct, and public morality would be rewritten or repealed entirely. However, new legal challenges would emerge. For example, rules around harassment or unwanted attention would become even more crucial. Police would need to be trained to handle disputes and potential crimes in a society where visual boundaries are far more open. The judicial system might also face debates over how to define and protect personal boundaries in a clothing-optional world, especially in workplaces, schools, and public transportation. Workplace culture would be dramatically redefined. Offices might have to choose between fully embracing clothing-optional policies or setting specific attire guidelines to maintain professionalism. Certain industries like manufacturing, firefighting, and construction would still require protective clothing for safety reasons. But many service-based industries could choose a more relaxed approach. However, businesses would also need to consider the potential distractions, discomfort, or interpersonal challenges that could arise in mixed attire environments. Human resources departments would face a new wave of policymaking centered around personal expression, body acceptance, and anti-discrimination protections. Historically, humans have had periods where clothing norms were far more relaxed. Ancient cultures, such as those in parts of Greece, Africa, and Polynesia, often had minimal clothing requirements, particularly in warm climates. In these societies, nudity was normalized in certain settings and did not carry the same sexual connotations it often does in modern, industrialized cultures. Reintroducing clothing-optional norms could, over generations, reduce the sexualization of the human body in some societies. This shift might lead to healthier attitudes toward body diversity and acceptance, as constant exposure to a variety of body types could normalize differences rather than idealize a narrow standard of beauty. Religion and cultural traditions would be among the most significant barriers to widespread acceptance of clothing-optional norms. Many faiths view modest dress as a moral or spiritual requirement, and a sudden shift to public nudity could create deep conflicts in communities where religious identity is tightly tied to clothing. These tensions could lead to protests, political movements, and even legal battles over the right to maintain cultural values versus the right to personal freedom. In multicultural societies, the challenge would be finding a balance between respecting individual choice and protecting cultural sensitivities. Technology could also play a surprising role in shaping this clothing-optional future. Augmented reality, AR devices might allow people to digitally clothe others in their own view, enabling individuals uncomfortable with public nudity to perceive everyone as dressed. This could create a hybrid reality where clothing is a matter of perception rather than physical fabric. At the same time, wearable tech like health monitors, body sensors, and personal climate control devices could replace traditional clothing functions, providing comfort and utility without covering the body. From a psychological perspective, normalizing public nudity would challenge deep-seated associations between clothing and social hierarchy. Without the visual cues of tailored suits, luxury handbags, or branded sneakers, economic status might become less immediately visible. This could reduce some forms of class-based prejudice, but also force people to develop new ways of signaling wealth, taste, or social belonging. The economy of luxury might shift toward exclusive body art, advanced cosmetic procedures, or even rare and expensive wearable gadgets. There would also be implications for gender dynamics and safety. While clothing-optional policies could empower people by removing restrictive dress codes, they could also expose individuals to greater risks of harassment, especially in societies where gender-based violence is already a concern. Preventing abuse would require strong cultural education and strict enforcement of consent-based norms. Over time, if handled responsibly, the normalization of body visibility could foster healthier gender relations by removing the taboo and mystery often surrounding the human body. Environmental considerations would also emerge. Clothing production is a major source of pollution, from water usage in cotton farming to synthetic microfibers entering oceans. A significant reduction in clothing consumption could have substantial environmental benefits, reducing textile waste and lowering the carbon footprint of fashion. However, this would also mean large-scale job losses in regions dependent on garment manufacturing, requiring economic transitions and support systems for displaced workers. Children growing up in a clothing-optional society would experience the shift differently than adults. Without decades of conditioning associating nudity with shame or taboo, They might develop more body-positive attitudes and greater acceptance of diversity. Education systems would need to adapt, incorporating body literacy and consent education into curriculums to ensure respectful interactions. This could also influence media and entertainment, where depictions of the human body might become more normalized and less sensationalized. Over time, a clothing-optional world could evolve into a society where clothing is purely functional, worn for weather protection, specialized activities, or personal expression, rather than as a constant social requirement. The long-term cultural effects would depend heavily on how the transition is managed, with some societies thriving under new freedoms and others experiencing deep divisions. If implemented gradually with robust education and cultural sensitivity, clothing-optional policies could lead to a more body-positive, environmentally sustainable, and socially equal world. However, without careful consideration of safety, consent, and cultural values, the change could also create significant social unrest and new forms of discrimination. Ultimately, the choice to embrace or reject clothing-optional norms would reflect deeper values about freedom, identity, and the human relationship with our own bodies.